name is Beaudry-Mellor, and we're going to do a quick round of introductions with everyone. I'm the former Minister of Advanced Education, the Status of Living Education, Saskatchewan, here in the province. I'm currently in the Chief Economic Development Officer role here at Economic Development Regina, but still very passionate and a member of the Leaders Council here for the Hill Business School. I'm speaking to you all from Treaty 4 territory here in Saskatchewan, and I would turn it over maybe, Curtis, if we could go over to you for a quick introduction.
Certainly. I'm Curtis Clarke. I'm the Deputy Minister of Advanced Education here in Alberta. And prior to this portfolio, I was also the Deputy Minister of Education for 4 years, leading into this portfolio.
Okay, and Scott?
Hi, good morning. Scott MacDonald, Deputy Minister of Education here in the province of British Columbia. And today I'm speaking to you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations.
Okay, Mark?
Good morning, everybody. Maybe Cathy, good afternoon. So Mark McLoughlin, Deputy Minister of Advanced Education. I actually celebrated, I didn't celebrate, it was just acknowledged my 4th year as deputy yesterday in Saskatchewan, and of course had the honor and pleasure of working closely with Tina for a number of years on a number of initiatives here in Saskatchewan, and really enjoyed that part of our time together, and certainly looking forward to today.
Okay, and Cathy, we'll go over to you.
Cathy, Montreuil. I'm speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. And I'm the Deputy Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
And Maureen, I see you've joined us. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to other panelists and to our audience.
Right. My name is Maureen McLaughlin, and I am a Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Education in the United States and the Director of International Affairs for the U.S. Department of Education. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
And we're delighted to have you on this panel. I'm really excited to hear your perspectives. And so let's maybe start up with our reason for being, and that's our students. So we know that some of them fared very well during this pandemic. Others really struggled. And the educational sector itself has, over the last number of years, really committed to equity, diversity, and inclusive goals for some time. COVID, however, really laid bare, I think, some of the gaps in our system, and the economic impact of the pandemic also, I think, really expanded our student base to include, a 40-something person who just lost their job. So Cathy, I really want to start with you on this one as the Deputy Minister of Education and Early Childhood. What is Nova Scotia going to do differently to be more inclusive on the equity and diversity fronts?
So we had just started with an inclusive school, an inclusive education policy, which was an umbrella policy under which all policy reviews and future policy work will land. We took time, in fact, a few years, to get out to first voice communities, to kids, to parents, to community stakeholders and partners to form that policy. One of the things the policy does is take as a given the disproportionality reflects system bias and racism and discrimination versus debate whether or not policies did it. So if there's disproportionality, it's a de facto sign that it's there and we need to unpack it and deal with it. So the piece of work that landed from a policy perspective was the fact that our policy work now must start with first voice. So it adds some time and complexity, but it also adds richness and less stops and starts. So when we first were looking at the impacts of the first wave of COVID, one of the things that was clear to us were that there were some communities, our African community, our Mi'kmaq community, and some others across the province who were less equipped to move to things like online learning or supporting learning at home. What we learned was when we went out to community and said, how do you need to be supported? What supports do you need and how do you? Their answers were quite different than we would have driven from the center out. I think we're the only province who offered through the flyers of newspapers a tangible learning support for all grades from pre-primary to grade 12 to support those families who didn't have internet, didn't have technology, and couldn't engage in that kind of online learning environment. And those communities said to us, the Mi'kmaq community came and said, if we're going to put this into the home of every family, we would like it to reflect Indigenous ways of knowing. And they made some contributions as elders to the math, to some of the language, and to some of the key learnings. One of our African communities said to us, we want to deliver that differently. We want to deliver it through community, because not only do our families need the resource, our families are telling us they'd like to be supported in supporting their students. And so we redesigned the delivery based on that impact. As we move forward, there are a number of pieces of work that are underway. So for the first time this year, we had designated positions to start to accelerate the reflection of our communities through our workforce. We have a module that's been co-developed with communities, students, and staff, particularly those from underrepresented groups, for a mandatory leadership module for every leader in the department and across the province on anti-racism and anti-discrimination. And the last big piece that I'll mention is that we've taken apart the curriculum and brought in again the communities, the First Voice, the equity-seeking staff to redesign our curriculum so that the unique history of African Nova Scotians, who were first in Canada to be migrated here, at the Mi'kmaq, LGBTQ, and newcomers, are reflected more deliberately and through their stories, their history, and their successes into our curriculum. So I can stop there because I know there'll be lots of commonalities, but those are the key pieces in the last 2 years we've been working on.
Yeah, that engagement piece is really important. And I like what you said, about the leadership model and designated positions. And I'm going to go over to Mark McLoughlin on this one, just because I know, Mark, you serve a population has a very high Indigenous population, and there are a number of designated positions with respect to Indigenous population. What did you learn from this, and what needs to change, sort of not to leave those learners behind? Is there anything maybe that Cathy didn't mention that Saskatchewan's doing differently?
Well, thanks for the question, and I think very certainly relevant, more so in the realm of both current and as we move sort of post-pandemic. As you're aware, Saskatchewan does have a large Indigenous population, and projected to grow, upwards to 21, 22% of the overall provincial population. A number of our institutions, I'll use Sask Polytech as a good example, 19% of their student population is Indigenous. Every one of our institutions in the province here has an indigenization strategy. They have a plan in place. It is, certainly front and center, and there's a large component of Indigenous students at every one of them. And so, as we entered into the pandemic environment and came to realize very quickly, our institutions did an excellent job, obviously, of pivoting to move to online or virtual platforms, and certainly that was very impactful to a lot of our Indigenous learners, and especially some of our institutions who are dealing directly, ultimately with that. And so, ensuring that as we continue to move forward, that we're keeping in mind the challenges that some of those communities are presented with in respect to, especially technology, the ability to have access to supported broadband as non-Indigenous communities do, and the ability to be able to have the outreach and delivering education into those communities rather than students needing to move outside of those institutions to get that education, I think is very, very critical. I don't think we'll ever get away from an environment where we don't have to take education into communities. I think we will always have to do that. Saskatchewan has a pretty unique sector model, which is actually designed to ensure that we have the ability to have the outreach around delivery as we do. And it's really then, ensuring that our institutions are collaborating on program delivery, on services, and identifying where those gaps are and working collectively, to address those, and not looking at it from a a competitive environment, but certainly trying to find mechanisms to provide solutions. Some of the challenges that we continue to see that we have to, as a province, address, with our sector, with our stakeholders, and with our partners, is around access to technology. And so, broadband is one item. The actual tools are, another issue, and the ability for utilization. The ability to adapt learning behavior, especially with our Indigenous students and Indigenous communities. As long as we stay within the context that we're in regards to the pandemic, the more challenge that we are going to have in regards to face-to-face learning. Our Indigenous students, have a preference of learning better in those environments, and not so much in the virtual online environment. So, critical around how we connect and stay connected with those students, and really sort of looking at the overall institutional strategy and outreach, but ensuring that those technological systems are in place and the ability for both the utilization of those and the learning that goes along, with that accessibility. We actually did, as Tina would know, we did a scan of our entire province around broadband reach. And it was interesting, undertaking that exercise, going into it with a perceived notion of where we were at versus what ended up coming out of that exercise, and really being able to sort of focus in on specific areas that were, lacking in regards to services and supports. And so being able to really sort of challenge and drive investments in those areas. But it's still, it comes down to, our institutions, and certainly staying incumbent upon them around what they are doing in regards to core functions and services to support, our Indigenous learners. Some of our organizations have done an excellent job around the implementation of language learning, moving that to the forefront, opening the door for opportunity of really devising new curriculum to support all languages in certain areas, in certain communities. Financial supports obviously are a critical element of that, and again, a key driver for us as a ministry to ensure that we have the appropriate financial supports that are in place that can also then complement what the federal government is doing and what their responsibilities are. Sometimes it's a fine line between responsibilities, and sometimes it's utilized in a way that at the end of the day impacts our Indigenous learner, and the responsibility falls upon all of us, both the federal government and the provincial governments and our communities, to provide those supports that are necessary. We've done a good job, I think, institutionally as well, of devising strategies around implementation for Indigenous role models in the province, and really sort of trying to carry specific messages to those individuals, those communities, implementation of student Indigenous advisors, the establishment of Indigenous student centers, all the mental health supports, learning circles, and so forth that are critical as well for long time ongoing learning. So overall we've seen a significant amount of work that's gone on, especially again at the start and during and at this phase of the pandemic. But what we did see was for about a 10-12 year period in Saskatchewan, we were seeing fairly decent growth in enrollment of our Indigenous students. During the start of the pandemic and at the start of the pandemic and during the pandemic, we saw about a 2% drop of enrollment of our Indigenous students. So that is, in all likelihood, as a result of, the shift to online and getting away from face-to-face. And so that's an area that we do have to focus in on and provide some resources and supports to ensure that we're getting that number back up. Retention numbers, however, continue to stay strong. And as well, graduate levels are considerably strong, and we're seeing an annual year-over-year growth on those student successes. So lots of work to continue to be done. Certainly a priority for Saskatchewan, given the strength of our Indigenous population that continues to grow. The age and the demographic of that Indigenous students, I think, is another critical piece too, because overall the success of that strategy really will impact how our province responds in a post-pandemic environment. And then we need to look at that as an excellent opportunity that's in front of us.
Okay, thanks. And I heard a lot of things there, particularly access to technology, which I think will be coming up over and over again as part of this conversation, the importance of role models. I want to now move over to Scott, because BC has a pretty high proportion of international students, and of course they have different kinds of challenges. So thinking, this is a panel on the future of learning, I guess. How was their experience different, and what will you do differently going forward as a result of this experience?
Thanks for that. And it's a good observation that we do have a long history of having international students coming to British Columbia and to be part of really, in many ways, a world-class education. We see this right across the country where people in other countries want to come to Canada to get an education. And it happens at K to 12, largely at the secondary years, grades 10, 11, and 12, and also in post-secondary. To put it in context, though, in British Columbia, we have 650,000 students in K to 12 and 21,000 international students in a pre-pandemic world. So that's 3.2% of our student population. In contrast, though, we've got 150,000 on the post-secondary side. So obviously much more common on the post-secondary side than K to 12. And what we saw through the pandemic is we didn't know what to expect in the first wave of this, as you can imagine. But last year, we actually had 50% of those students show up. We had, I think, over 11,000 students in BC who actually managed to come to British Columbia. They came through the protocols and they did the self-isolation beforehand, and parents were comfortable enough sending them there. And our schools in British Columbia were open all last year. We had no school closures last year. They're fully open. So students did come and they met those requirements. But as we start thinking about where we go from here in the future, I think there is a bit of a balance we need to think about because this was not an equitable distribution of the students in British Columbia. First, they're highly concentrated in our urban districts around Vancouver and Metro Vancouver area. And we got about 18 districts. I think have the vast majority of our students. They bring in $250 million. Now it's on a base of $7 billion, so it's a lot of money, but it's not a huge percentage there. And they're also very much focused on very few countries that come. We're kind of dependent on just a few that come here. And those students show up typically for about a year, often in grade 11. They'll come in for a year, they do a program, and then they leave. So not coming to get a full graduation certificate, although some do, but they're very much kind of in, out, and they get the experience there. The challenge we have with this is that there are some districts actually have some very, very high percentage of students who are taking these programs. Our highest district has 18% of their secondary students are from another country. And so when you start thinking about what do we do when we go forward, we have to come back and reflect on why are we doing these programs? What are the values for them? And I think there's a number of educational values that we have around welcoming people from other countries into our communities, the experience that students get in interacting with them. But at what point do you hit a tipping point where you have too many of them and they saturate the learning environment where it becomes a different kind of a learning environment? And you start reaching other challenges, be it language challenges, curriculum continuity, and those types of things. So we have to think about these benefits from an education point of view beyond just the tuition generation that this gets, the $250 million that flows into the province. So as we go forward, I think there's a number of things we need to think about. One is getting that right balance of the percentage of students coming to the program. So it's in a sense we haven't oversaturated our schools. We have an equity issue in that we have some school districts that can generate, tens of millions of dollars a year that go into other programs for those students in those school districts. Yet there's other school districts in the province that have zero international students. They're in a geographic location that just cannot attract people that would want to come from another country and pay a tuition to go to a small remote community in British Columbia, for example. So we have an equity issue there that I think we need to be thinking about as a province as we move forward. So I think as we go forward, you're going to see a rebalancing of the programs. I think we're going to come back to our first principles, values, of why we're doing them. ensure that when we build them back, that we've got the right kind of controls in place as we go forward. And see this very much as an integral part of our education program, but I think with that equity lens being first and foremost in what we're doing across the province. So that's where we're at today, and we'll see how it emerges as we come through the next phase of the pandemic and people begin traveling more.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm hearing you say indirectly is a bit more focus on strategic enrollment management and sort of equity across the piece, as you said, rebalancing, which is really interesting. Curtis, I want to go over to you and to talk a little bit about, we have sort of a new or expanded audience, student body, which is, those individuals who maybe unfortunately lost their job as a result of the pandemic, or decided to make a change as a result of their experience of the pandemic and the work-life balance they wanted. And so can you maybe speak to that? What are we going to do differently coming out of COVID to sort of attract or retain lifelong learners?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And, when I think about the current context of lifelong learning, I'm kind of reminded of an old advertisement slogan. This is not your father's Oldsmobile. So again, we're looking at something completely different from what we're used to here. I mean, the concept and approach to lifelong learning is clearly being dramatically influenced by the changing nature of work, rapid expectations of upskilling and reskilling, even differing expectations of industry and the need for an adaptive workforce or a nimble pipeline and talent pipeline. And it's also being shaped by, to your point, Tina, a changing nature of the learner. So we're looking at societal sectors like the gig workforce for sure, the NEET sector, and that's the not employed in education or training. And that's a very large segment of individuals in the ages of 18 to 29. Looking at mid-career shifts, those individuals who have either lost jobs or are looking at transitioning out of the world they're in now, but need to look at upskilling and reskilling. And then also sort of the adaptability of institutions to meet the needs of real-time labor market data that shows us where the new transitions are, where the new jobs are, what the new skills and competencies are. So again, it's not the old extension faculties like we would look at, it is that lifelong component of it. But what's exciting is what we're doing. And I think there is a quickness of nimbleness in terms of how governments and industry are responding to that. And I think this is truly the exciting part as we move forward into the future and how we think about it from not only a government perspective, but from our post-secondary institutions and even at the K-12 level in terms of how do we think about that transitional piece. I mean, a good example is right now, many jurisdictions and institutions are working on the concept of micro-credentials. Here in Alberta, we've just funded 56 different micro-credentials with 19 institutions with about $5.6 million to help seed that and get that going. And these programs are related to identified needs in both the labor market and what industry has told the institutions that they need for that transition into new skills and competencies and the new workforce and certainly the tech sector as well, but not just tech. And then you're also looking at this globally. The EU has also implemented a broad micro-credential strategy. So they're clearly focused on funding this and recognizing the value of micro-credentials in that lifelong environment. Ontario, BC, from the post-secondary worlds are also very focused on supporting micro-credentials with the post-secondary institutions and partnerships with industry and are funding those to see where they will go and how they develop. And then Australia has also taken a large step and has started to create even a bit of a clearinghouse of micro-credentials that have been set up and funded by the federal government in Australia. But the other piece that's very interesting around this is that these are not terminal items. There's a clear sense that lifelong learning means lifelong learning, and you need to be able to stack these micro-credentials, stack these different programs. They can't be terminal because we're expecting the workforce to be nimble and constantly responsive. It's also a case of if you start at a micro-credential, it may ladder into a diploma and into a degree, and you need to have that accessibility and transferability. And industry is also expecting that as part of that ongoing career development element. I think the other part of it that we're starting to see now is that governments broadly are starting to think about this in the context of skills agendas and strategies, so that lifelong learning is a part of that skills development. Going back to the EU, in July 2020, they articulated and set out a skills agenda that had 12 different sort of elements to it. Alberta, we just finished Alberta 2030, which is the Building Skills for Jobs, which is our legislative change into our Post-Secondary Learning Act and sort of guiding that strategy. Look at Singapore, Skills for Future Framework, and enabling all Singaporeans to be funded in that lifelong trajectory of education. I think the other interesting piece, again, is going back to the idea that this is not your father's Oldsmobile. In the past, you know, lifelong learning and extension faculties and these kinds of programs were not necessarily linked to partnerships with industry. And we're now starting to see that industry plays a very prominent role in the exposure of students, the need for the skills and competencies, the clear partnerships between post-secondaries and industry in terms of what those programs are, and access to industry in different sectors as we grow as well. So I find this to be a truly exciting time for us, and a really remarkable transitioning moment in our history around both the needs of learners, but also what are we doing as a collective?
Yeah, I love so much what you said there is future focused. And I particularly love the idea about the nimble pipeline. I think there's a lot there in terms of attracting new students throughout the course of their lifetime in many ways. And we'll get to some of the structural discussions that needs to go along with some of those changes in a minute. But before we do, I want to go over to Maureen, who has joined us from the United States and might have a slightly different perspective on equity, diversity, and inclusion coming out of the pandemic. What would you like to offer in terms of learning, key learnings in the United States as we think about the future of learning, the experience of the pandemic, and EDI goals?
Great. Tina, thank you very much. And the thing that I'm struck as I listen to this conversation is, you know, the similarities of the challenges that we face in our two countries. We, like Canada, are a decentralized country, so our education is delivered in the local community, and in our case, states, in your case, provinces and territories. So that's very similar, and like you, we're a big country, and there's a lot of diversity of what the issues are in any particular community. Equity and inclusion and diversity are absolutely positively key to our agenda. And as several people have already said, the pandemic revealed gaps that might have been worse than we thought, and exacerbated gaps and have resulted in learning losses in particular communities, more at-risk communities that are greater than what happened to people in more affluent communities. So at the federal level, there are major historic investments in building back better. This is across all sectors, but there's a major investment in education. And with that, we really have a couple of key themes that I think touch upon things we heard here today. One is to recover from the pandemic. So how do you reopen schools safely? That's a big, big issue. And you know, this is the very beginning of school years in the US. Many schools were not physically open last year. So that recover from the pandemic, reopen safely, and get back on track. But not just back on track, because we want to be better. We want to address a lot of the things that came out and that we already knew, but that have come out even more clearly. We want to reinvest in our students. Students are the focus of education. They are the focus of what we're doing. So how do we reinvest in our students? And at the same time that we're recovering, that we reimagine the future. So those are really the themes that we're operating on. And in that, from the federal level, we're putting in resources to expand access to preschool and pre-K. So that's at the front end of the sort of spectrum of when people go to school. And then also investing additional resources in community colleges, which are our two-year colleges after high school, to make those more accessible to people, to expand for skills development, for catch up, for preparation for going into a university. And we're also investing in high quality job training and apprenticeships, and particularly looking to do that in fast growing sectors. Much of this touches upon the kinds of things that Curtis was talking about. So certain sectors would be public health, would be IT, would be, green energy. I mean, all kinds of things like that. And then something that we haven't talked too much about here today is to invest and support teachers, because teachers have had a struggle during COVID themselves, and teachers are key to how our system both recovers and how our system builds back better. So that's overall the approach that we're taking. And I'm going to mention two other things that I think fit into the conversation today. And one comes to Scott's discussion about international students. So the US has just issued a renewed focus and a renewed commitment to international education. So our Secretary of Defense and our Secretary of Education released just very recently a joint statement of principles in support of international education. And we think of international education as international students coming to the US, but we think of it as our students going overseas to other countries in person or virtual, and what happens on our campuses, these sort of internationalization of education, of additional language learning, and things that are happening in our schools and in our universities. So this statement is the first such statement that's been released in about over 25 years. And so it's a major commitment, and it came out, the reason I suggested that we do it originally in this new administration was that international education had suffered during COVID. We weren't as successful, I think, as Scott described, in terms of kind of maintaining people in the country necessarily. Some people did stay, some people did it from afar, but we also didn't necessarily have a welcoming feeling. We would hear and see that people were concerned about whether there was a welcoming country and whether we were really welcoming students in, and were policies that were being put forward, motivated by other things than education. So in those principles, and we have 10 principles, and I'd be happy to share this with people. There's documents and et cetera. And in it, I want to mention sort of 3 different ones that I think are relevant to the conversation here. One is the welcoming and valuing, and I guess that goes back to what Scott was talking about. We are making it very clear. We welcome, we value, and we want international education, and we want people to come here and have an experience that is beneficial to them and to our country. We also emphasize diversity. And there are 2 key principles that are emphasizing diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is we'd like students that are coming here to this country, to our country, to represent a broader sort of spectrum of countries and levels of income, et cetera. And we'd like them to be able to go to a wider diversity of institutions. And I think that touches again a little bit on what Scott said, so that people come to a wider range of our either schools or our colleges, and rural, urban, all of those things. And then another piece is that we want our students who are experiencing international education, and again, it can be language learning, it can be going overseas for a semester, it could be going over to Canada for a year of study. We want that set of people who take advantage of those kind of opportunities to represent all students in this country. So it's not something that's a special thing that some people get, but it's part of an integral education for everybody. And we want to make sure that that opportunity is, again, available to students, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, et cetera. So I think those things really resonated as Scott was talking to that particular initiative. And then I'm going to do one sentence on something that we are hosting, the International Summit on the Teaching Profession this year, in doing it virtually from the United States. And the emphasis of that summit is to elevate and enhance the teaching profession in order to improve student learning. And this year's emphasis is on the whole child. And what is it that teacher unions and schools and ministers and secretaries should be doing to come together to try and elevate the whole child? So it's the academic learning, it's the physical and mental well-being, it's the social emotional learning. So that's a global piece. Canada will be participating in that summit, as will a number of other countries around the globe. So just several things I'd put forward, and I'm really enjoying learning from my Canadian colleagues.
Very much, Maureen. I heard a couple of things there, and I am going to come back to the teaching conversation. because I do think that's an important in terms of the future of education and how we attract and retain educators. And I also heard, reputation from both you and Scott in terms of attracting international students and the importance of the reputation of our sector. I'm going to move now into a little bit about skilled labor, and Curtis, you specifically talked about this in some of your discussion. The skilled labor is in high demand across the country as the provinces compete with each other, and our country competes with the globe on sort of economic recovery. And there's a real urgency to filling some skilled labor gaps. So there are, however, structural challenges to sort of moving that forward. And in particular, Curtis, you talked about, the gig workforce and micro credentials. All of these things sort of require some debundling and a bit of velocity of change. Alberta is building towards an outcome-based funding model, and I guess I want to get some of your thoughts. It's a pretty major structural change. How will it make Alberta education more competitive?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And yes, you are right. It is a structural change. And certainly when you start tinkering with funding models or funding practices and frameworks, there always is that structural impact. And this took us over a year to get to this point, because what we've done also is we've aligned this to a strategic framework. It wasn't just something where we said, let's play with the funding framework and sort of just use the outcomes of a financial framework to make the changes that we need. What we did was we built the strategy over the last year and a half, engagement across the system, and looking also at international models to see where are the trends and how do we get to meet those particular sets of goals. Now, there are 6 goals that came out in Alberta 2030, building skills for jobs. And I'm actually going to talk about 4 of those because they do kind of link more to the learner and that competitive element that we're looking at in terms of really what are our students going to achieve when they come out? How are they more competitive? How are they going to meet the needs of the labor market and the needs for jobs and skills and those areas? So the 4 that I'm going to talk about briefly is, the first one is improve access and student experience. The second is develop skills for jobs. The third is support innovation and commercialization. And after listening to Scott and Maureen, I thought I would just flip this one in too, because it does play into the competitiveness, is strengthening internationalization. And when we talk about internationalization, we're talking about, yes, bringing students into Canada and into Alberta, but also our access for our students globally, for them to have experiences globally, because we see that giving them a competitive edge. It gives them a better sense of the global trends, different cultures and ethnic groups, and that exposure enhances their ability as learners and to embrace that lifelong learning component. But the 3 that I really want to focus on are the other 3 that I mentioned, and how we're actually incentivizing the institutions to start thinking about the things that we want them to do. And this goes back to the financial element of it. So what we're doing is, through these strategies, they have clear outcomes and goals that we want to have the institutions meet. And in order to do that, we're linking them to what we're calling investment management agreements. So within each of those goals, there's a set group of outcomes and directives that we would like the institutions to meet. And what we're doing is we're setting up through these IMAs an opportunity for them to meet goals and clear sets of outcomes. And if they do not meet those outcomes, then there will be a consequence, and it may be a clawback on a part of their budget that's aligned to those particular outcomes. And I'll take, for example, out of the improve access and student experience. One of the first ones that we're working with the institutions right now is work integrated learning. The goal of Alberta 2030 is that by 3 years, all institutions and all programs will have a work integrated learning component of all of their program areas. Right now, many of the institutions are clearly embracing this and are working towards that. But our first set of IMAs related to that have set up a percentage and claw back if they do not meet that percentage. But the goal there is to ensure that our students have a work integrated learning component to all of their education, so that they're exposed to the environments that they're going to be working in. They have an opportunity to experience the transfer of knowledge in a work environment as well. Other areas that we're looking at that eventually, as we build further IMAs, will be in and around micro-credentials, transferability, that again, that the programs that institutions are delivering, and from the micro-credential to the diploma, to the apprenticeship programs and into degrees and graduate work, they will all have elements of this. And that again, we're trying to ensure that the student from that access and student experience are having the best opportunity to apply those skills. And thus when they come out to the workforce and out to society, they're able to hit the ground and be nimble to fit into that talent pipeline. The other part of that is develop skills for jobs. So again, working with the IMA aspect of it and continuing to help incentivize and create partnerships around the labor market force, using data, real-time labor market data to help institutions build programs that are responsive to the needs and responsive to the needs of students and the learner as they're also transitioning through that trajectory of education. Another piece of that is support innovation and commercialization. We're right now in the midst of a research commercialization working group. We've brought most of the major post-secondary institutions that have research intensive institutions and representatives of many of the industrial sectors that are growing and we want to support in the province and globally. One of the things that's come out of that is not just the idea of intellectual property and commercialization. It is about building the talent pipeline. If we are going to be innovative, if we're going to look at commercialization, if we're going to come up with some of the best research-based work, we need to have a talent pipeline that will continue to feed that, that will support that as we move on. And those will be one of the areas that we, through our funding framework and our IMAs, will be able to incentivize those relationships, build those relationships between industry and the post-secondaries and government, and continue to move that forward as a strategic goal of what Alberta 2030 is. So we've used the funding framework and our different mechanisms to ensure that that is moving through as a set of outcomes and meeting the strategy, and I believe will make our students competitive and able to adapt to this nimble change of where I think the workforce and the workplace is moving.
So one of the things that's really interesting about that, Curtis, is that, you know, it's a very different role for government in the post-secondary sector than what existed previously. That's a major structural change. It's a lot more prescriptive and accountable than has existed before, and even extends into intellectual property. I want to build on that a little bit and move over to Cathy. Both you and Mark kind of talked about the lack of high-speed internet and how that affected inclusivity and accessibility for some of your learners. That's going to require some interministerial collaboration within government, which some people might argue is a pretty significant change. Can you maybe speak to what Nova Scotia's experience has been about this and how you're going to sort of advocate or plan differently going forward?
Yep. So the response around the flyer strategy, et cetera, came out of the very first wave. So back now a year and a half or so ago, when we all between March and June ended up for the most part at home. And the realization that we had that issue hit all of government pretty much all at once. And we instituted a survey of parents around how did that work for parents, how didn't it, what worked. And through that in education, we found that 30% of our homes had reliable enough internet and enough technology to manage that period of time. So 30%. So we did strike, government did strike senior officials a table across government to look at what to do about that. And so certainly it was removing barriers, obstacles, and moving funding into increasing broadband access across the province. It was also then looking at, if while we're doing that and while we improve the infrastructure and get access addressed, how do we get supports addressed? So there was, for instance, the Service Nova Scotia looked at how do they move antiquated processes online? How do they take out barriers? The business people looked at how do we leverage technology to remove barriers for the growth of small business, the support of minority-led businesses, those kinds of things. In education, we looked at certainly the quality and the infrastructure and how do we ratchet up good online learning experiences despite where you are or who you are in education. We also moved to things like cashless financial programs, automaticity in common educational functions, online assessments. So a lot of work was done in the last year and a half on that. Upskilling, reskilling of folks who were affected by the pandemic or before the pandemic and needed to be ready when the economy opened to take advantage of those opportunities. So the senior officials table kind of slice and dice this problem in a whole bunch of different ways. Government funded and incentivized the broadband partners to get more aggressive we turned up the speed on everything. So when I put out a survey, I got 12,000 parents responding at the end of this year. 99% of them said they had access to technology and the internet, and 75% of them said it was robust enough to meet all of the needs of their households. So that's a year and a half's progress. That's not stopping. It's continuing. If anything, we're leveraging. And so that the funding during the pandemic was really spent with an eye of necessary for COVID, but strength beyond, and strength beyond connected to learning opportunities, employment opportunities, and simplifying access to service for Nova Scotians. So there's been a lot. The work continues, and there's a lot more to do for sure.
Yeah, and that whole interministerial collaboration piece is particularly important as you think about the sort of the whole child discussion that both Maureen and I think Scott perhaps have referenced in other locations. I want to go back also to the structural issues around how we educate, train, recruit, retain teachers as a result of this experience and how that'll be different. And Maureen, I'll come back to you in a minute, but I want to start with Mark on this one. And Mark, if you could just maybe, what needs to change there in how we deal with the teaching profession, how we recruit, retain teachers in this sort of future of learning environment?
You know, it's the $1 million question. You know, as we continue to move forward, and obviously the changing demands of particular of the learner, as that continues to evolve over time, we have to have, and they have to have the ability for adaptability, and be able to look at, you know, the entire sort of teaching around subject matter from a global context, the ability to be responsive, I think, and adaptable, understanding better the knowledge of the learner, and certainly the knowledge of the teaching that is necessary for, you know, today's learner. So as we see the significant shifts, especially on the post-secondary side, the profile and learning of a post-secondary learner today, you know, has changed and it will continue to change dramatically. Our teaching profession at that level has to have the ability to adapt accordingly, and to be able to move along with those respective changes. First and foremost, we need to make room. You know, part of the challenge in higher education is that the ability or the lack of movement at the top level of the education system, in and around, you know, not having a mandatory retirement in place, tenure, which keeps, you know, institutions sort of at capacity, does not create opportunity for fresh learning to be coming into institutions. So, you know, as we look at the whole sort of sustainability issue, that's an area and an item that we have to start to address at a very, very high, broad level. There's also the diversity components that's going to be, certainly necessary. It was interesting just looking at, certain activities that have gone on, in particular here in Saskatchewan over the last number of months, where we went out to all of our institutions to look at diversity policies, especially as it related to racism and other areas. What was shocking was not one institution had a policy in and around diversity and or racism. Some were ultimately, in the works, but certainly it's indicative of our slowness to respond to, the demands of what's happening in the realm of our environments. Our learners certainly are shifting demand for programs of study. We're starting to, quite significantly at the post-secondary level. There's growing demands among students for more flexible options. I think Curtis may have referenced the OECD, and some of the elements that have been cited there, also tied in with the Alberta 2030 activities as well. The ability as well to be able to adapt to online learning is going to be critical. And so, as we look at, our complement of teachers in regards to how we attract, train, retain, it's going to be critical that they have that expectation of flexibility, because we need to be shifting very, very quickly, and the demand of the learner is going to shift very, very quickly. We need to have infrastructure that allows that to take place. And part of that is, how do we, from the top on down, how do we ensure that we have the ability to manage that accordingly? How do we keep up, especially at the post-secondary level, to those shifts, from our learner, from shifts on the demographic side, and shifts, that are certainly there from industry. We have to be much more open to industry involvement. We have to be much more open to collaboration. We have to be much more open to the development of partnerships and working more hand in hand in and around allowing our institutions to be able to shift accordingly. So, that adaptability to me is a real critical piece. I also believe that, the future of teaching cannot be shy of accountability. Accountability has to become a major component of what we have an expectation of in regards to how public dollars are being utilized to support education and to support development and growth for our workforce as we move forward. And again, coming down, the prioritization, most provinces are prioritizing economic immigration as a key component, especially in the realm of a post-pandemic environment. And that comes back to, again, our diversity piece and the ability to be adaptable there, and to ensure that we are looking at attracting individuals that come with a broad level of global knowledge and context in order to support, our changing demographic of learner.
Interesting. Where you ended, and I think Curtis also sort of spoke to it a little bit about that being outwardly focused, and it's no accident that Alberta and Saskatchewan have export-led economies, and so really need to think about that. And Curtis, and so Scott as well, thinking about international students, those things are really important. Maureen, I want to go over to you because the teaching profession is something that you were quite passionate about. And I want to ask you, what does the future of the teaching profession look like in the United States?
I think the future of the teaching profession is we want a profession that is adaptable, as we just talked about. We want a profession that looks like and reflects students in the classroom. So, in terms of areas we need to attract, we need to train, and we need to be able to recruit and retain teachers. But we need to be sure that we have teachers of color, for instance. And so there is our efforts around the country, but also support in funding from the federal government to help support getting more teachers of color into classrooms, because we know that it's really important for students to be able to see people who look like them in terms of models of behaviors and options and career tracks, so that we want to be able to really address places where we have either teacher shortages overall or shortages in certain areas. So again, one place is to sort of grow your own teachers up through the pipeline and move from paraprofessionals into teaching to support getting more teachers of color into classrooms. Special education, that's another area that we really need more attention to, getting more teachers and more teachers who are doing special ed. There's also bilingual, certainly in terms of the international piece I talked about, getting more teachers who are teaching well other languages is really important, so bilingual teachers. Also science and career and technical education, moving into some of the things we were just talking about. So really putting a really big emphasis on valuing the teaching profession. And I think valuing the teaching profession includes listening and hearing what their concerns are. And, that's something that was always needed. The pandemic exacerbated it. Secretary Cardona is a former classroom teacher, and, he knows and values what happens in the classroom, and he's listening and talking with, encouraging and supporting people who are in the classroom now, but then also bringing in others in the future that gives a greater diversity and spread of both the individual people and the kinds of teaching positions they go into. The International Summit on the Teaching Profession is also, in terms of its emphasis on looking at the whole child this year, is also looking at issues of well-being. So the well-being of students, but also the well-being of teachers, because if teachers are not, doing well in terms of their own health and their own support, it's hard for them to give that support to the students in the classroom. So that is a big piece, is to really look at that well-being issue of both the students, but also of the teachers. There's an international survey of teachers, and what we found in the United States in that survey back some number of years ago, that teachers who were teaching in the United States were really very happy that they were teaching, but they felt like they wanted training that really fit the needs they had, rather than the training that was just provided, or the training that gave them opportunities for advancement. But they wanted the kinds of training that really addressed their own needs, their needs for collaboration, their needs for working across classrooms, across grades, across all kinds of things. So I think there's a wide set of things that we need to do on teachers, and it touches upon, as Mark said, very much what happens in higher education, as well as what happens in K-12.
It's interesting that you noted that. It's almost like a micro-credentialing approach to the teaching profession as well, and allowing them to bundle skills together in order to be able to better meet the needs of the community that they serve, which is really interesting. And I think throughout the pandemic, we all, we could do an entire panel on mental wellness in the teaching profession and in education at large. We can do an entire week on that, I think. So I just want to flag that. As we start to wrap up the panel, I sort of want to wrap this up with a little bit of blue sky. So I'm going to ask you each to sort of, you've been in your roles for some time, you managed pre, mid, sort of, I guess if we can call it post, I'm not sure if we're post-pandemic yet. You've all talked about the needs that change. Some of you have really referenced some of the global trends. I want you to think about, and I'm gonna challenge you to do this in 2 minutes tops. What is the future of education, and what is your hope for the future of education? What will it look like? And Scott, I want to start with you.
Well, thanks. Well, big question, and I'll summarize it in 2 minutes. Let me just offer a couple of thoughts, not to be completely exhaustive on the topic, but I think the pandemic, we've called this the COVID magnifying glass for the last year, and it has magnified some amazing, wonderful things that happen in society and in education. From the role that we play in schools and communities, the supports that we provided, the accessibility, providing meals to folks, and an education, all those things that we have. And when we couldn't do some things, it became very apparent the role that they became, even things like extracurricular sports that were happening, or other kinds of interactions you have with kids we couldn't do through the pandemic. But I think our education system generally became an integral part of society and got acknowledged for that. But this magnifying glass also put a big, huge focus on a bunch of other things that weren't so good. This has magnified inequity, for example. We actually saw, and we've been gathering data because our schools were open all last year. And we had 90% of our kids back in. A few were doing some online programs, very small percentage, but it started to separate this gap out. And we actually saw, believe it or not, an increase in intent of attendance in British Columbia. More kids came more often to school. All the controls we put around COVID actually made kids actually healthier. We were actually having less sick days and more kids showed up. But those who didn't, we saw falling further behind. And those who were vulnerable before were more vulnerable afterwards. And we had this growing gap. As we saw the achievement actually increase a lot of kids, others, it was separated. So, for example, our First Nations Indigenous students, we saw a marked gap grow in a large number of districts in British Columbia that we need to put our attention and focus on. So I think that the future we're going to look at is going to be one that I think is going to have to be much more inclusive, much more equitable, focusing on the methodologies that work, being much more sophisticated in our monitoring or measuring of performance, responding to those things in a much faster way, in an understanding that that we have the ability and I think the tools and skills now to make those quick responsive changes that are necessary to better prepare people for the future. And what we heard through much of the conversation is that future is going to be filled with disruptions. We just went through a massive disruption. And those who succeeded through that disruption had the resilience, the skills, and the adaptability to do new things. And I think that will be the emphasis that we're looking at in our school system, is around preparing people for that kind of adaptability and those kinds of changes. So giving them that strong foundation from which they can accommodate and adjust to the next big thing that comes to them in their lives, be it a large global thing or even things that happen much more at a personal or local level. So I say that with a fair bit of optimism. I think we've come through this reasonably well in British Columbia, I think most of Canada. And I think from these lessons learned, I think we're all motivated as we get through these final stages of the pandemic to apply those lessons and build an even stronger foundation for the future. So I'll leave you with that thought.
I like the motivation piece, especially. I really feel that on this panel. Cathy, I'm going to go over to you. We haven't heard from you in a little bit, so I'm going to jump to you next. Tell us about your quick blue sky vision of the future of education and learning.
So kind of springboarding off Mark, I think that in order to kind of move forward, because I think many of the foundational learnings that he shared with us are common. So as we look forward, I think it's also going to change structures, becoming less time bound, more individual. However, I think another thing the pandemic taught us was the value people put on the interpersonal, the value that people put on the relational. So I don't see technology taking us away from that. I think that in the future, we're going to find the balance. We're going to find the disciplines that require a relational base to develop those skills. And certainly as we become more international, those skills become more important and more universal. So I think we'll have that. I think building on Maureen, I think we'll see greater diversity in the workforce. Certainly our Mi'kmaq community and our Black community have said to me very bluntly, you want more diversity in your workforce, graduate more of our kids. So that kind of effectiveness and creating learning environments that are invitational to who you are and speak to who you are. So I think that we'll see as we move forward, the role of technology cannot be underestimated in terms of its influence. But I think that COVID has taught us the balance of the interpersonal with the technological. And then I think the moving away from structures as notions like micro-credentialing influence structures and delivery, I think we'll see what we value in learning, what we credit in learning, and the time-bound nature of learning will all be fundamentally changed as we move forward, for the better, I think.
I was going to ask you if you thought it was for the better, but you added that in, so that was great. Mark, I'm going to go over to you. What's your blue sky vision of the future of learning?
Well, I think if our institutions or our leaders across Canada believe that the current structure of bricks and mortar and the traditional method of learning is here to stay. I truly believe that they're going to get left behind. I don't think there's ever been a time in history where the brand of an institution, is going to mean more than it does right now. The ability for them to have to compete, the ability for students to be much more selective for an institution based on its brand and based on its reputation is going to be critical for really the survival of some of our institutions moving forward. Their ability to be able to adapt to what we saw at the start of pandemic, which I think we would compliment all of our collective partners and around our sectors in every province to adapt quite quickly. The fact that now the digitization of teaching is here to stay, right? It's here to continue to grow. I think we've seen a transformation of teaching and learning that is not going to go backwards. That is only going to continue to grow in other forms and in other ways. It spurred, obviously, COVID spurred an acceleration in this area. There were certainly plans underway, but it forced institutions to get there much more quicker. We're seeing a widening access, obviously, for learners that we've talked about, and institutions needing to really understand their role and responsibility in transforming those student learning experiences outside of the classroom. So things like peer learning, self-directed learning, work-based experiential learning opportunities, I think, are going to be much more at the forefront and paramount for the success of our institutions and our systems moving forward. And hopefully that adaptability at the top inside our institutions is clear, and the ability to drive that change internally, I think, will remain to be seen.
Excellent. Maureen, what are your thoughts on the future of education and learning from the United States?
There are so many pieces to blue skying, and everybody here different ones. So I'm going to focus on one piece, and that is the internationalization and the real need for cultural and global competencies. If the pandemic showed us anything, it is a complete reminder of how interrelated and interdependent the world is, and each of us is, and each of our countries is. So if I have one sort of piece I would emphasize here, I would love to be in a position where every child, every adult in the United States is culturally and globally competent. They've had the opportunities for internationalization of their curricula, of their schooling, of their in-person or online experiences with people around the world, things like what we're doing right here. So that would be my blue sky, would be that everybody has those opportunities in a real and meaningful way.
Wow, I sometimes struggle with thinking this sort of blue sky question is a bit of a glib question, but it always comes up with some of the best things. And Curtis, no pressure at all, but you get the last word on this great blue sky question. And what can you offer that's really profound to our audience?
So if I were blue skying, what I would want is that we as leaders in government, in our public institutions, and in industry, to sort of look at the future from the art of the possible and not the art of the confirmed. Yeah. Do not go back and just say what we've had is what works and we're just going to hunker down into that, because that's survival mode. That is truly the place to be. But if we're looking at the art of the possible, that is where we will thrive. This is where our students, our industries, our institutions will thrive in that environment. And we need to have an open mind and think of it as an ecosystem so that we are connected, and that ecosystem fights against the silo-based approach to just hunkering down and surviving. That would be my goal, and my hope is that we look at the art of the possible and we always think in those terms, and we drive our policies and our actions based on that.
Well, I don't think I could have said it any better. That's a great way to wrap up. Well, I really want to thank each and every one of you for being passionate leaders in your respective spheres and bringing that passion and insight into this discussion. I also want to thank Convergence.Tech for putting on the Future of Learning Conference. There's some great speakers. If you have the opportunity to catch some of them today, Convergence.Tech is very interested in how we're moving forward as a sector and how that is being digital. And so we want to thank them for getting all of us together to have this conversation. And I'm really excited to see some of the things that come out of it. So thank all of you for your participation. Have a really terrific day.